going to say it's not going to work. It does.
Okay, and so just to advance.
I guess so. That's not even mine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate you still being here. And as I look around, most of you look like you're still awake. So I really appreciate that. So this is the last of the morning. I'd like to think they saved the best for last, but it's more likely that they have saved the oldest for last. So I've been doing this kind of research. I've been publishing research on neuromuscular responses to exercise for the last 32 years. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, you know, how can some guy who's probably in his 40s be publishing for 32 years? Well, thanks a lot, but I have to admit, I was a child prodigy. So I'm going to talk about neuromuscular responses to exercise, a lot of practical stuff here, as well as alluding to the neuroscience behind that as well. So as Greg was talking about, he had his origin story, and I've got my origin story as well here. So typically we go into certain areas because obviously we're interested in that area. When I was younger, like 45 years ago, so obviously I'm not 40, 45 years ago, I was a pretty good athlete. I played junior hockey. I was a provincial champion in tennis and in squash, and I was drafted in the Canadian Football League as a professional football player. I never made it to the Professional Football Hall of Fame because I only played for 1 month, and I got cut. And I really wanted to be a professional athlete. And so when I didn't make it as a professional athlete, I then became very interested in why. And so one of the problems I had as a football player, I wasn't the fastest running back in Canada or anywhere else. So I wanted to look at how can people get faster. And so this was my first kind of introduction into how the body works and how we can adjust. So back in about 1993, we published a paper where we're taking a look at something related to what's called the velocity specificity of training. So if you want to exert high forces or a lot of strength at fast speeds, which is what you want to do if you want to sprint, then you've got to move at fast speeds according to this concept. But we also knew that if you want to contract at a high speed, your central nervous system, your motor neurons, send out signals at a very high frequency. So we were wondering, is it the output? Is it the central nervous system sending out those high frequency signals? Or according to the concept of velocity specificity, is it how fast you move? So is it top down or is it bottom up? So what we did in this case was we had people train for 16 weeks. We put them on this device here. One leg was isometric, so it didn't move at all. So according to the concept, if it didn't move at all, there's no velocity, then we shouldn't get strength gains at high speeds. The other foot did dorsiflexion, moved up, and they trained dorsiflexion at high speeds. So that foot should have shown increases in strength at high speeds. But in both cases, we told these people, we want you to contract as hard and as fast as you can. Imagine you're exploding into the machine. So after 16 weeks, we tested them, and lo and behold, both groups had the greatest force output at high speeds. So even if you didn't move, there's absolutely no movement, you still had this velocity specificity. So it was a top-down type of a response. It was the response to the central nervous system that caused you to have greater forces at those high speeds. So again, being an athlete, my whole career has been to, as Ben I think was saying, you need to be skeptical, you need to have curiosity. So in the 1990s, you'd walk into a weight training room and you'd see these things, and people would be standing on what's called a Swiss ball or an exercise ball, or they'd be standing on Bosu balls. And again, concept of training specificity. If you're playing a sport or you're in an activity where it's unstable, then you should train under conditions of instability to get your body used to that. So it sounded logical, but of course, does it really work? If you stand on a Swiss ball, are you going to get stronger? So these are just some of the devices that you'll see in a weight room these days that allow you to have an unstable environment. Now, there's a saying that you've probably heard of, or maybe not. It's an old saying, and so I'm old, so I know what it is. You can't shoot a cannon from a canoe. So obviously, if we had a big cannon in this canoe, all right, at Quidi Vidi Lake, and you shot it off, what would happen? Well, the canoe would just fall over and you'd fall into the lake. What you need is you need to be really stable. And if you've got a big boat like this one, you can fire off a big gun, all right? So you need a big stable core to fire off big guns, or you're throwing a football, you're hitting a tennis ball, you're jumping, you need that stability. So you think, okay, well, maybe I should be training on these unstable surfaces to develop my central nervous system to give me a better core, better stability, better balance. So what happens when you actually do training on an unstable surface? Well, unfortunately, your force drops. So for instance, in this article here, we found that your isometric force dropped by like 60%. Well, if you want to be stronger, you want to be lifting heavier weights to put more strain on those muscles. In another study, we had people doing squats either on the floor, which would be moderately stable, on this device here, which would be moderately unstable, or on these Bosu balls, which are really unstable. And what we found was in all cases, when they're unstable, everything went down. Power went down, force went down, velocity went down. People couldn't move as much because they're unstable. So this doesn't seem like a great environment for improving your strength and your power. But there are advantages to instability training. One of them is when you're unstable, you have to stabilize your core. So what happens is that you tend, and your joints, you tend to increase the activation of your muscles. So when you're doing lower forces, you have higher activation of the muscles. So somebody like myself who was a high-level athlete, I want to go in, I want to lift as much weight as I possibly could. But not everybody wants to go in and lift heavy weights. And so people who are not interested in this heavy lifting, or maybe if you need rehabilitation, you can't lift heavy weights, you can still get high activation of your neuromuscular system by providing some degree of instability. So we wrote a position stand for the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology, and we also found that just doing free weights, like doing squats and deadlifts, that was also fairly unstable and also gave you fairly high activation patterns. So what we said was that ground-based free weight lifting, like squats and deadlifts, etc., are highly recommended because it combines instability and high forces. And so if you're an athlete and you really want to get as strong as possible, that's what you should be doing. But if you're in rehab, you're just interested in health, you're not interested in lifting the heaviest weights in the world, you still get great benefits in terms of health and fitness if you're going to go on an instability device. So one might say, balance is the key to life. All right, another area that we were interested in was resistance training. And we knew from in the past, back in even in the 2000s, people were saying children shouldn't resistance train. They're going to cause injuries and damage their epiphyseal plates, and then they're going to end up with one arm shorter than the other arm. And so there's all sorts of associations that said they shouldn't be doing resistance training. So since the 1990s and 2000s, there's lots of associations that said no, resistance training is very safe for children if done properly and has a lot of health benefits. But one area that wasn't well researched was, what about power? Should children be doing power training rather than just slow resistance training with lighter weights? So we want to take a look at that. And one of the types of power training that's quite popular is called plyometrics. So plyometrics is bouncing and jumping and hopping and bounding. And so now you've got, remember the concept of velocity specificity, where you want to move fast in order to train the body to be able to exert high forces at high speeds. But will it work for children? So what we did, this is an ugly table, but what I want you to just think about here is that we've got a combined group, and what we did, another thing about children is their balance isn't as good as adults. So we were wondering, should we have children doing balance training along with the plyometric training? Would that be a good way for them to advance their power output? And so in this one, we had a group that did combine. They did balance and power training or plyometric training. We had a group that just did plyometric training. And of course, you always have your control group who sits there and drinks Cokes. All right. And if you notice, under combined, we had all these different measures. The combined almost always gave large increases. in whatever measure we had there. When you looked at the plyometric training, it was almost always moderate increases. So if you combine balance and plyometric, the balance helped the positive effects of plyometric training in children. Because again, children don't have as good a balance capabilities as adults. Then we were wondering, well, what about the sequence? If we're going to have a bunch of children doing this combined training for 8 weeks, 16 weeks, or whatever, should they do the balance training first, or should they do the plyometric training first? So you can see here, BPT, balance before plyometric training, versus plyometric training before balance training. And you notice with balance before, we've got significant increases that are greater than when you did plyometrics. So once again, in children, we need to prime their balance. We need to improve their balance so that when they go to do power type activities, that they can benefit to a greater degree from those training protocols. Again, people worried about putting too much strain on children. And so it's always been recommended, do very slow movements with light weights, make it very simple, maybe use machines, it's safer. But children are pretty adaptable, and we got some pretty amazing athletes as children. So we were wondering, what if we use more advanced training techniques? So this is called a clean, which is an Olympic weightlifting technique, and you see this adolescent female performing that activity. And so we're wondering, can children do these advanced techniques? So we had a study here where we had children training for 12 weeks. Some of them were using Olympic weightlifting, so doing those cleans. We had another group doing those plyometrics that we talked about before. We had other ones just doing the traditional, nice, slow, very safe type of training. And what you'll see down here are effect sizes. The magic number is 0.8. 0.8 and larger means you got large magnitude changes. Something big is happening. And we measured a lot more than this, but just to keep in time, hopefully, Olympic weightlifting had the greatest effects on counter movement jump and horizontal jump. So in children or youth, so there's, in this case, we were using adolescents, they can do Olympic weightlifting, and it had the greatest effects. Now, of course, you have to teach them how to do it properly. Just don't jump into it without any progression. But with proper progression and teaching, children and youth can use these more advanced resistance training. So again, we wrote a position stand for the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology on children's resistance training, and we said you need a properly supervised and instructed resistance training program. You got to have the right size equipment. You got to have the exercise corresponding to the child's capability. But if you progressively overload and supervise them properly, they can use a wide range of exercises from simple to complex. All right, so again, back when I was a football player, I was told, well, okay, you're a little slow. Maybe what thing you can do is you can improve your flexibility and you get a longer stride length, and then you'll be faster. And then you'll get into the Football Hall of Fame. But what happened was that in the 90s, we started to see a lot of studies saying, ooh, if you do static stretching, there's going to be losses in strength and losses in power. There's going to be all these impairments happening. So since I had spent a long time stretching, I was really interested in this. So lately we just did a meta-analysis which just takes a look at all the studies and determines what kind of changes happen. Obviously, this is obvious, but sometimes you need to quantify the obvious. And this is talking about the chronic effects of training on range of motion. And again, if we take a look, the effect size was 1. Remember, 0.8 is large. So obviously, you stretch, you get an increased range of motion. No big deal there. It doesn't take a lot of brains to find that out, but we quantified it. But what's really interesting, though, is non-local effects. So we've done a number of studies. One study, we stretched the right hamstrings, and then we tested the left hamstrings. The left hamstrings had a greater range of motion. We didn't even touch the left hamstrings. They got better. Another study, we stretched the groin muscles, the adductors, and tested the shoulder range of motion. The shoulder had better flexibility. We then stretched the shoulders and tested the hamstrings. The hamstrings had better flexibility. So you've got this global effect of stretching. You don't have to stretch your shoulders, just stretch your hamstrings and your shoulders will have better flexibility. So we see here in this meta-analysis that, again, the magic number here is 0.86, meaning in all these studies, on average, if you stretched one part of your body, you'd have a large magnitude increase in the range of motion of another part of your body. So there's something global going on here. I don't have time to talk about all the mechanisms, but maybe you can ask a question later. All right? So like I said, the problem with static stretching is we have these impairments. We said in a number of our reviews, I said one of the big problems is that people stretch too long. All right, you should stretch for less than 60 seconds per muscle group. And when you're stretching as part of a warm-up, it should be a full warm-up. You should be doing aerobic exercises, dynamic exercises, and when you do that, you really don't see too many impairments. So we were asked to do another review just a couple of years ago to see what had happened in the last 5 years. And again, part of the problem with the move away from static stretching is these unrealistic stretching protocols. So many of the stretching protocols, remember we said you've got to do a prior aerobic warm-up. Well, only 2/3 of them do that. We said you shouldn't be doing more than 60 seconds. Well, 2/3 of the studies did more than 60 seconds of stretching per muscle group. We said you should be doing dynamic activities right afterwards. And only 15% added that. So when you're reading these studies, you've really got to look, if somebody stretches a muscle for 20 minutes, nobody stretches a muscle for 20 minutes. So obviously you would expect some deficits happening there. So very important to take a look at the literature and make sure that what they're doing is ecologically valid. What else is wrong? Well, a really interesting study by one of our undergrads in 2016 was, about the placebo effect, but there's also the nocebo effect, all right? So our kinesiology students come in and do the study. Well, we've already taught them that prolonged static stretching will cause impairments. So we bring them into a study and we have them do stretching. It's already in their brain that there should be deficits. So we were thinking, well, what if we brought some people in, I don't know, like a philosophy student, doesn't know anything about stretching, and we tell them stretching's good for you. If you stretch, you're going to get stronger. And guess what happened? We brought them in and all those philosophy students got stronger. They didn't get weaker because they believed they were going to get stronger because they were told they're going to get stronger. And we're not the only ones that did this. It's Bertolacini. So we looked at strength. Bertolacini looked at endurance, and he found the same thing. That when you told them they'd have more endurance, after stretching, they got more endurance. So very important in terms of nocebo and placebo effects. So in our one of our reviews on stretching, we said, you got to be cautious because even, maybe there's only a 1% impairment. Well, you look at the guy down the left-hand side there. Obviously, you know who he is. It's Usain Bolt, the most famous sprinter in the world. The guy on the right, has anybody ever heard of Gerald Fierre? Oh, you did? You must see my TED Talk then. Gerard Fierre ran against Usain Bolt in the 2016 Olympics. Gerard Fierre was 5% slower, actually 4.78% slower than Usain Bolt. That doesn't sound like a lot. Well, it's not a lot, but it means that Gerard Fierre made it to the semifinals and came in second last place. He didn't even make it to the finals. He was second last place. Almost nobody, other than this very intellectual person over here, knows who Gerard Fierre is. All right? So it's a difference between millions of dollars. I doubt Gerard Fierre makes as much money as Usain Bolt, and it was a 5% difference. So you really got to be careful how much of that static stretching you're going to do, because even a 1%. Andre de Grasse lost to Usain Bolt in the last Olympics. He was 1%, I calculated this, 1.00007% slower, and he lost. So maybe he just did a little bit too much static stretching. So you got to be careful. But how many of us are going to the Olympics? Almost, I doubt, anybody in the Olympics here? There we go, nobody in the Olympics, all right? So if you're going to do stretching, we know that it helps to reduce musculotendinous injuries. So is it important for us if we have a 2% decrease in force output? You're going to go play golf, instead of hitting the ball 100 meters, you hit it 98. Who cares, all right? Now, if you're Djokovic, the tennis player, or somebody, or Usain Bolt, you've got a physiotherapist, you've got an athletic therapist, you've got a massage therapist, you've got an athletic conditioner. They're hanging around with you, treating you every day so that you don't get that 1%. But most of us, we would rather have not gotten an injury and then be able to play our golf or tennis the next day. And then another advantage of static stretching is you actually can get stronger. So we've done a meta-analysis here. The effect size was 0.2, which is small. So it's not as good as weight training, but if you do continuous stretching, you can have a small magnitude increase in your strength output. I've got a long presentation. Do you know my time? Give me a few more minutes. All right, so we've done some, again, walk-in weight room in the early 2000s. People are doing this stuff on foam rollers. So again, as a scientist, people are making a lot of money doing this, but does it work? So in the original, when it was first introduced, they used to call them self-myofascial release techniques. And so they're saying that when you roll the muscles, you're going to break up these scar adhesions, and you're going to feel better, less pain, more movement. But what a number of researchers have said is that you need supramaximal threshold strength in order to break up these adhesions. And so the word self-myofascial release technique really isn't the right reason. And so what we did is we have at least one, this was a really good study done by Jalal Abu-Darda, who's now at the University of Calgary, with Dwayne and others. And what they did here is that they identified these tender spots in the calf. And then what we did was we rolled those tender spots, or we massaged those tender spots, or we just did a sham where we barely touched those tender spots. Or here's the big one. We rolled the opposite leg. And so what we found was that if you rolled the same leg, this IPSI-R, what you got is you got an increase in the pain pressure threshold. So you could handle more pain. You're less sensitive to pain. If you did massage on that leg, you had increased pain pressure threshold. All right, great. That means rollers work. They decrease pain. Do they work because you're releasing adhesions? Well, the surprising thing is all you had to do was roll the other leg, the contralateral leg, and you still got an increase in the pain pressure threshold. You didn't even have to touch the leg that got hurt, and the pain went down. So how could it be decreases in adhesions if you don't even have to touch it? All right. So foam rollers do work, but they don't work the way that a lot of therapists had said back in the early 2000s. All right. And then these meta-analyses are just saying that, yeah, if we do rolling, we will get an increase in range of motion. And your point, so it's almost a large magnitude. Is it as good as stretching? It was as good as stretching. There's no difference between stretching and foam rolling if you do an acute bout of foam rolling. If you did training, so let's say you rolled for 8 weeks or you stretched for 8 weeks, you got a large magnitude increase. But with training, stretching was a little bit better. Stretching provided you with a greater range of motion if you trained over a prolonged period of time. Now here's a really interesting study. So then we're thinking, okay, all right, foam rolling works. We've seen that a lot of times. But is it really foam rolling, or is it just moving? So what we did is we had people roll their legs with a foam roller, and then what we did, we got a dolly. You know what a dolly is? Like you can move your furniture with a dolly. It's got 4 wheels. So what we did, we stuck a pad on a dolly, and we had people do that foam rolling effect. All right, doing this action here. So there's no rolling involved, just movement. And then we tested the range of motion. And I'm guessing you're going to guess what happened because I'm so excited about it, is that it made no difference. Both groups had the same increase in range of motion. You didn't need a foam roller. All you had to do was pretend, all right, that you had a foam roller. And you got an increase in range of motion. Now, we didn't say in the paper that foam rolling doesn't work because we've done studies where we had the researcher do the rolling and we got an increased range of motion. We got a machine that you put on the person and we can have the researcher do it. Increased range of motion. So what it means is that the movement increases range of motion. Foam rolling increases range of motion. You stick them both together, there's no additive effect to it. All right? All you got to do is move. Okay, we're almost finished here, almost finished. Last one, non-local muscle fatigue is another area we're looking at. This is related to what I was talking about with the stretching. If I fatigue this arm, we found that this arm gets tired, even if you don't do anything to it. You fatigue this quadricep gets tired. All right, that's called crossover fatigue. But what we were wondering about was heterologous fatigue. So if you fatigue your left bicep, does your quadricep get tired? You fatigue your right quadricep, does your bicep get tired? And what we found, and the literature has found, is that if you're only going to test strength, you don't see much of a difference. But if you test endurance, there's a contralateral effect for endurance. And that if I fatigue this arm, this leg, if I try to do an endurance test, it won't have as much endurance. So again, there's something global going on with the central nervous system causing this global effect. And the last one here is, when you take a look at children, if you do a training program, you train this arm with an adult, this arm will get stronger, but it's not going to be as strong as the arm that you worked at. In this study, we had children do unilateral leg presses. That's all they did, unilateral leg press. One leg, boom, boom, boom. Then we tested a whole bunch of hand grip and leg curls. And if you do leg presses, your hand grip gets stronger. And in children, your hand grip gets, if your leg presses went up 50%, your hand grip went up 50%. Everything went up 50%. You didn't even have to work it out. So again, there's this global mechanism going on, and it's especially strong in children. There's my lovely daughter. I'd like to thank you. And I've only been talking for 2 minutes, it says. All right. So thanks for your attention. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. So that concludes our